Welcome back to Horror Shadows, where the darkness reveals its deepest secrets. Tonight's story comes from a former security guard who reached out to me after stumbling across my channel. He insisted I share what happened to him during his brief employment at Mercy General Hospital. What you're about to hear took place over the course of just 5 nights. 5 nights that would change everything he thought he knew about life and death. This is The Graveyard Shift. David Martinez was desperate for work. 3 months unemployed, bills piling up, and his girlfriend threatening to leave him. So when the overnight security position at Mercy General Hospital came up, he didn't ask too many questions about why the last guard quit without notice. The pay was decent for watching empty hallways from midnight to 8 a.m. The hospital had been built in 1952, and like many old medical facilities, it had that sterile yet somehow oppressive atmosphere that made your skin crawl even during the day. But David's assignment wasn't the main hospital floors. No, his job was something far worse. He was responsible for securing the basement level, specifically the mortuary and pathology department. The basement was a maze of white-tiled corridors lined with fluorescent lights that hummed incessantly. The mortuary occupied the entire east wing, complete with examination rooms, storage areas, and the main morgue, where bodies awaited pickup by funeral homes. David's supervisor, a tired-looking man named Frank, gave him the brief tour on his first night.
Look, kid, it's simple. Walk the perimeter every hour, check the doors, make sure nobody who shouldn't be here gets in. The morgue stays locked unless Dr. Chen or one of the funeral directors needs access. Here's the key, but don't go in there unless absolutely necessary. And David, if you hear anything weird, just ignore it. Old buildings make noise, pipes settle, nothing more than that.
David's first night passed without incident. He made his rounds, checked his doors, and spent most of his time reading in the security office they'd set up in a converted supply closet. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous tune, and occasionally he'd hear the building settling, creaks and groans that echoed through the empty corridors. Around 3 a.m. he decided to take his first patrol of the mortuary wing. The hallway seemed longer at night, stretching endlessly under the harsh lighting. David checked each room methodically. Examination room 1, examination room 2, the pathology lab, the cold storage area for specimens. Finally, he reached the main morgue. The room was exactly what you'd expect. Stainless steel tables, industrial sinks, and along the far wall, a bank of refrigerated compartments. Currently, 7 of the 12 compartments had red occupied tags hanging from their handles. David did a quick visual sweep and was about to leave when he heard it. He froze. The whisper was so soft he couldn't be sure he'd actually heard anything. David stood perfectly still, listening, but the room had returned to silence, except for the gentle hum of the refrigeration units.
Just the cooling system.
He locked the door and finished his rounds, but for the rest of the night he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been off. David's second night started normally enough. He'd convinced himself that the previous night's unease was just new job jitters. After all, working alone in a hospital morgue would make anyone's imagination run wild. But during his 2 a.m. patrol, things began to change. As he approached the mortuary wing, David noticed that the fluorescent light at the far end of the corridor was flickering. Not unusual for old fixtures, but it cast dancing shadows that made the hallway feel alive. He checked the examination rooms as usual, noting that Dr. Chen had apparently worked late. There were fresh specimen containers in the pathology lab and some paperwork scattered on one of the examination tables. When David reached the morgue, he paused before inserting the key. Something felt different. The air seemed heavier, almost thick enough to taste. Inside, everything appeared normal. 7 occupied compartments, same as the night before. But as David conducted his visual inspection, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Compartment number 4. The red tag was hanging at a different angle than he remembered. Not significantly, but enough to catch his attention. David approached the compartment carefully. The tag was definitely positioned differently, as if someone had touched it. But who? Dr. Chen wouldn't have needed to access the bodies during the day. They were waiting for funeral home pickup, not examination. As he stood there staring at the tag, David heard it again. The whisper. This time there was no mistaking it. Someone, or something, was whispering. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, like voices carried through the ventilation system. David's rational mind told him to investigate, to find the source, but every instinct in his body screamed at him to leave. He backed toward the door, his eyes fixed on compartment number 4. Just before he reached the exit, he could have sworn he saw the compartment door move, just slightly, a tiny shift that could have been his imagination or could have been something pushing from the inside. David almost didn't return for his third shift. He'd spent the day researching the hospital's history online, looking for any explanation for what he'd experienced. What he found only made things worse. Mercy General had been built on the site of the old city sanitarium, which had burned down in 1951. 43 people had died in that fire. Patients who couldn't escape their beds, trapped in a building with inadequate fire exits. The sanitarium had been notorious for its treatment of mental patients. Experimental procedures, unauthorized surgeries, patients disappearing from records. When it burned, many suspected it wasn't an accident. Armed with this knowledge, David returned to work that night with a new sense of dread. He'd brought a small digital recorder, planning to capture any strange sounds he might hear. The first sign that night 3 would be different came during his midnight rounds. David noticed that his footsteps seemed to echo strangely. Not the normal single echo he'd heard before, but a doubled sound, as if someone was walking parallel to him in another corridor. He stopped. The echo stopped a fraction of a second later. By the time he reached the mortuary wing, his hands were shaking. The flickering light from the previous night had been replaced, but now a different fixture was strobing intermittently. Inside the morgue, David immediately noticed that compartment number 4's tag was completely askew, hanging horizontally instead of vertically. But that wasn't the worst part. Compartment number 7, which had been occupied the previous night, now showed a green vacant tag. David checked his clipboard. According to the log, no bodies had been picked up during the day shift. So where had number 7 gone? "Let us out. So cold. Been waiting. Let us out." David fumbled for his recorder, but his hands were shaking so badly he dropped it. The device clattered across the floor and came to rest near compartment number 4. As he bent to retrieve it, the compartment door swung open. Inside was empty. But the temperature in the room plummeted instantly, and David could see his breath forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The whispers became a chorus, voices crying out from every compartment, some occupied, some empty. They weren't asking to be let out anymore. They were warning him to get out. David grabbed his recorder and ran. David should have quit. Any rational person would have turned in their badge and never looked back. But something was drawing him back to that basement. He needed to understand what was happening. He'd spent the day listening to his recording from the previous night. Most of it was just the sound of his own panicked breathing and footsteps. But buried in the background noise were the voices, clear as day when isolated and amplified. They weren't speaking English. The language sounded older, more guttural. David had sent the audio to a linguistics professor at the local university, claiming it was for a research project. The professor's response had chilled him to the bone. This appears to be a dialect of Latin used in medieval medical texts, specifically those dealing with anatomy and surgical procedures on the deceased. Night 4 began with David arming himself with more equipment. In addition to his recorder, he'd brought a digital camera, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a small notebook to document everything he observed. The hospital felt different that night. Even the upper floors, which he occasionally patrolled, seemed more oppressive. The usual background noise of medical equipment and ventilation systems was absent, leaving an unnatural silence. When David reached the basement, he found the mortuary wing in complete darkness. Someone had turned off the main power to that section. His flashlight beam cut through the blackness, revealing the familiar corridor. But something was wrong with the geometry. The hallway seemed longer, with more doors than he remembered. Doors that led to rooms that shouldn't exist. David approached the morgue with growing terror. The door was standing wide open, despite the fact that he'd locked it personally at the end of his previous shift. Inside, his flashlight revealed a scene from a nightmare. Every compartment door was open, all 12 of them, and they were all empty. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. In the center of the room, the examination tables had been arranged in a circle. On each table lay a body, but these weren't the recent dead waiting for funeral pickup. These bodies were old, decades old, mummified and wearing the tattered remains of hospital gowns from another era. David began taking pictures, his hands surprisingly steady despite his terror. Through the camera lens, he could see details that his naked eye couldn't perceive in the dim light. The bodies weren't random. They were arranged in a specific pattern, arms positioned to point toward the center of the circle. And in that center, carved into the floor, was a symbol David recognized from his research, the mark of the old city sanitarium. The voices returned, but now they were coming from the bodies themselves. Dry, ancient whispers that spoke in that same medieval Latin. David's translation app managed to pick up fragments. The ceremony, incomplete. 43 souls, one more needed. That's when David realized the terrible truth. The fire at the old sanitarium hadn't been an accident. It had been part of some horrific ritual, one that had never been completed. And these bodies, the patients who had died in the fire, they'd been waiting 70 years for someone to finish what was started. David spun around as he heard movement in the corridor outside. Shuffling footsteps, dozens of them converging on the morgue. But when he looked, the hallway was empty. The footsteps were coming from inside the room. The bodies on the examination tables were moving. David ran. There was no other choice. Behind him, he could hear the ancient bodies sliding off the examination tables, their movements accompanied by the sound of cracking bones and rustling fabric. He reached the corridor and sprinted toward the exit, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of him. The doors he passed were no longer the ones he recognized. They bore plaques with names in Latin, and from behind them came the sounds of medieval medical procedures. David's flashlight began to flicker, and in the strobing light, he caught glimpses of figures standing in doorways. Doctors in old-fashioned surgical gowns, their faces hidden behind primitive masks, watching him run past. Finally, he reached the stairwell. Behind him, the basement had fallen silent, but David didn't stop running until he was outside the building. He never went back. David called in sick the next day, then simply stopped showing up. When the hospital tried to contact him, they found his apartment empty. But before he disappeared, David sent me everything. His recordings, his photographs, his research notes. He also sent me one final message.
I know what they wanted. The ritual at the sanitarium was supposed to claim 44 souls, but the fire only took 43. They've been waiting for the 44th person to complete their ceremony. I think they were trying to make me that person, but I got away. I hope I got away. If you're reading this, and you never hear from me again, then maybe I didn't. Whatever you do, don't go looking for me. And don't go to that hospital. Some places are better left abandoned to their dead.
That message was dated 6 months ago. I've tried reaching David multiple times, but his phone is disconnected and his email bounces back. I did some investigating of my own. Mercy General Hospital closed down 3 months ago, citing structural issues and budget constraints. The official records show that during David's 5-day employment, no security incidents were reported. But here's what the records don't show. In the week after David disappeared, 7 people went missing in the area around the hospital. All were found days later, their bodies discovered in impossible locations. Sealed rooms, locked buildings, places they couldn't have accessed, and every one of them had been drained of blood. The hospital still stands empty. Sometimes, people report seeing lights in the basement windows late at night. Others claim to hear voices, whispers in a language they don't understand, calling out from the abandoned building. The city plans to demolish Mercy General next year, but I have to wonder, can you really destroy something that was never truly alive? Can you bury secrets that refuse to stay dead? And somewhere out there, David Martinez is either living under a new identity, trying to forget what he experienced during those 5 nights, or he's become the 44th soul the ritual needed. This has been Horror Shadows. Remember, the darkness is always watching, and some shifts never truly end.